The dream always started the same way. A woman's hands, dark green and scarred along the knuckles, pressing something cold and heavy into his chest. The weight of it was real, more real than anything else in the dream, and her eyes were amber, burning like torchlight behind storm glass. She said something he couldn't hear. The world behind her was burning. Then she was gone, and Cale Draven woke up gasping in his bunk with the taste of wood smoke and iron in the back of his throat. He had the dream 4 times before the war started, 5 times before he met her. He was 29 years old, a logistics corporal embedded with the 14th Forward Supply Battalion, 3rd Expeditionary Force, operating on the outer ridge of the Verk contested zone. Humans had been fighting the Bloodfang Orc Confederacy for 11 years. Not a clean war, none of them were, but this one was particularly ugly in the way that wars between neighbors always are. The Bloodfang had come off their plateau hunting farmland. Humans had tried to take the plateau. Both sides had been bleeding into the same soil long enough that nobody remembered what winning was supposed to look like anymore. Cale's job was not to fight. His job was to count things: ammunition pallets, ration crates, medical supply loads, fuel canisters. He was good at it. He had a memory for numbers the way some people have a memory for faces, and the brass valued that enough to keep him far enough from the front lines that he only heard the artillery as a low, continuous mutter on clear nights. He was not brave. He knew this about himself the same way he knew he was left-handed and bad at sleeping, as a fact, without judgment. His bunk was in a prefab housing unit behind the equipment shed, and the equipment shed smelled of oil and grease, and the particular chemical sweetness of standard-issue fuel tablets. He'd been in the zone for 14 months. Before that, he'd done a 2-year rotation on the supply lanes supporting the Northern Defense Corridor, which was an older theater with more infrastructure and considerably better coffee. He thought about the coffee sometimes. Not fondly, exactly, but with the specific nostalgia you develop for things that were adequate when nothing else is. He shared the bunk unit with 2 other logistics specialists, Private First Class Dina Marsh, who sorted cargo manifests with an efficiency that bordered on aggression, and Corporal Marcus Weil, who could sleep through artillery and who Cale had decided represented the evolutionary apex of the species. They were competent. They were reliable. They were not, in any meaningful sense, interesting, and Cale had accepted that interesting was not a thing the logistics track provided. This was before the dream started making him look at his hands when he woke up, checking them as if expecting to find something pressed into his palms. The day everything changed, he was inventorying a supply cache in Grid Sector 7 Gamma when the Bloodfang rear element hit the ridge. They weren't supposed to be there. That was the thing that undid every plan. The 14th's position was 5 kilometers behind the main contact line, which was 5 kilometers behind the Bloodfang forward pickets, which meant there was 10 kilometers of mutual misery between Cale and the nearest enemy combatant. That math stopped being true at 3:40 hours when a Bloodfang flanking column, cut off from its main force by an airstrike that had gone longer and harder than anyone predicted, came over the ridge with nowhere left to go except through the supply depot. Cale heard the first shots and did what his training told him to do, which was find cover and radio for help. He got behind a stack of fuel canisters, bad choice, he knew immediately, but the alternative was open ground, and keyed his radio and got static. The attack had hit the comms relay first. Smart. He heard the battle pass over him like weather, shouting in Orcish, then Standard, then Orcish again. The heavy crash of something large going through the equipment shed wall. The sound of boots on packed dirt at various speeds indicating various levels of urgency. 3 distinct bursts of weapons fire, then a long quiet, then a single shot that might have been a finishing shot or might have been someone stumbling in the dark, and then nothing for almost 2 minutes. He kept his head down and his breathing slow, and counted seconds the way his grandmother had taught him to count during thunderstorms, not to measure time, but to have something to do with his mind while the world came apart around the edges. She had been a practical woman, his grandmother. She taught him to count during thunderstorms and to check manifests twice, and to carry more than he thought he needed. And he'd applied all 3 lessons to the army and found them more useful than anything they'd taught him in basic. The shooting stopped about 4 minutes after it started. That was when she fell through the gap in the supply tent wall. She hit the packed dirt floor and rolled, and Cale had his sidearm up before he'd thought to reach for it, and she was up on one knee with a blade already at arm's length, and for about 3 full seconds neither of them moved. She was Bloodfang. He could tell that by the gray-green skin, the heavier jaw, the close-set amber eyes that were currently doing a rapid assessment of him, the way you look at a door to see if it opens inward or out. She was wearing a half-destroyed officer's cloak, Bloodfang insignia, though the rank marks were missing, cut away, or maybe torn. She was bleeding from somewhere above her left ear, and she was breathing hard, but she wasn't panicking. He noticed all of this, and also noticed that she was trying to get away from someone rather than toward him, because her eyes flicked back through the hole in the tent wall twice in the first 3 seconds, and her blade hand was already adjusting its angle to account for the possibility of a second threat behind her. "Don't," she said in standard. Her accent was heavy, but the word was clean. "Not planning to," he said, which was true, because she outweighed him by a significant margin and the blade was longer than his reach. She evaluated him for another beat. Then she reached inside her cloak with her free hand and pulled out something that caught the dim light from the tent's overhead lamp. A circlet, bronze dark and set with a single deep red stone in the center, worked in the angular knotwork style he'd seen on Bloodfang ceremonial pieces in intelligence briefings. Tribal royalty. Senior bloodline markers. The stone in the center was the color of cooling embers, and the knotwork around it was worn smooth at the highest points from years of handling. She held it out. He stared at it. "Take it," she said. "I don't." "Take it now." Her eyes went to the wall again. Voices outside, Orcish, 2 distinct tones, one commanding, one urgent. "Close." She pressed the circlet forward and he reached for it on instinct, his fingers closing around the cool metal before his brain had approved the action. The thing was heavier than it looked. "Hide it. Do not give it to your officers. Do not tell anyone you have it." She met his eyes, and whatever she found there was apparently sufficient. "I will find you." She was gone through a different gap in the tent wall before he'd finished breathing in. He stood there with a Bloodfang royal crown in his hands, the sound of enemy troops 10 meters away, and absolutely no idea what had just happened to his life. He put the crown in his backpack. It was the only thing he could think to do with it. He pressed it down between the spare radio battery and 3 days of emergency rations, and fastened the main flap, and set the pack against the fuel canister, and resumed not being visible. And 3 minutes later the 14th's quick reaction force arrived, and the Bloodfang unit was pushed back off the ridge, and nobody came into the supply tent and asked him anything. He went back to counting things. But his hands remembered the weight of the crown in them, and at night, when he closed his eyes, the amber ones were waiting. He told no one. That was the first decision, and it was easy. The way the right decision is usually easy once you've looked at the actual shape of it. Telling command meant the crown became a political asset. Political assets got leveraged. Leveraged meant Grath's people would know someone had it, which would make Sira findable by what she'd lost. He didn't know why she'd trusted him. He suspected he'd passed some rapid evaluation in the tent that he hadn't been consciously aware of taking. But he understood that the trust was conditional on his keeping it, and breaking it felt like breaking the math of a manifest that had come out clean. He didn't do that. Dina Marsh noticed he'd come back from the attack with his backpack significantly heavier than he'd gone out with it. She said nothing. This was one of the things Cale had appreciated about Dina Marsh. She noticed everything and commented on approximately 15% of it, which was a better ratio than most people managed. Marcus Wilde did not notice, because Marcus Weil was constitutionally incapable of noticing anything that wasn't directly between him and sleep. Cale went back to the morphine count. The morphine count was still wrong, and the wrongness of it was a more manageable problem than thinking about what was in his backpack. Her name was Sira Vorn, which he learned approximately 18 days later from an intelligence dossier that landed on the desk of Major Callum Rist, the 14th Senior Intelligence Officer, who was not supposed to share it with logistics corporals, and who did anyway because Rist had a gift for knowing which rules existed to protect information and which existed to protect careers, and this was very clearly the second kind. Rist brought him the dossier in a plain folder without a word, set it on his work table between two cargo manifests, and left. That was how Rist operated. He believed in giving people information and then giving them a few hours to decide what to do with it, which was an unusual philosophy for an intelligence officer and a very effective one. Sira Vorn, the dossier said, was the third daughter of the Bloodfang High Warchief Doruk Vorn, though daughter was a translation approximation of an Orcish kinship term that actually meant something closer to blood-chosen heir of the stone lineage. The Bloodfang didn't reckon succession by birth or to the way humans did. They reckoned it by the crown marking, a ritual in which the ruling warchief designated an heir by placing the circlet, the same weight Cale had been carrying in his pack for 18 days, on the chosen head in front of the full war council. Doruk Vorn had placed it on Sira's head 14 months ago. Doruk Vorn had been dead for 11 months, an assassination, method unconfirmed. The Bloodfang Confederacy was currently splitting down the middle between the Crown faction, those loyal to Sira's claim, and the Iron Tusk Coalition, led by a warlord named Voruk Grath, who had been one of the senior war captains under the old warchief, who had expected to be named successor himself, and who had spent the past 11 months doing everything in his power to make Sira's claim impossible to enforce. He was currently operating somewhere in the contested zone with a private army of 12,000 and a burning desire to be the next high warchief, and the specific desire of a man who believes he was cheated, which is more dangerous than ordinary ambition because it has the energy of grievance behind it. There was a photograph in the dossier. Intelligence had captured it from a Bloodfang communications intercept. It showed a woman in an officer's cloak, full Bloodfang formal rank insignia, facing away from the camera toward a gathering of war captains. You couldn't see her face, but the posture was distinctive, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to be very calm in rooms full of people who want things from them. He recognized the posture. He reread the part about the assassination twice. Then he went back to his bunk and looked at the crown sitting in the bottom of his pack, nestled between the battery and the rations, and understood that he was holding the single most politically significant object in the Bloodfang Confederacy inside a logistics corporal's worn canvas field pack, and that the woman who had given it to him was either very desperate or very smart or possibly both. He was leaning toward both. He also understood, sitting on his bunk in the gray light of the prefab unit with Marcus Weil snoring 3 feet away, that the thing she'd done was more complex than it looked. She hadn't just needed to hide the crown. She could have hidden the crown anywhere. She'd needed to hide it somewhere Grath's intelligence apparatus would never look, because Grath would be looking everywhere that a Bloodfang political operative might hide something of value, with sympathizers, in Crown faction territory, at any location connected to anyone she'd ever spoken to. The one place Grath's people wouldn't look was inside a human logistics convoy, because it required a level of trust in a stranger that made no tactical sense. Which meant she was either foolish or she was very good at reading people quickly. He thought about the 3 seconds in the tent when she'd evaluated him before pressing the crown forward. He thought she was very good at reading people quickly. She found him on the 19th day, which was impressive given that the 14th had moved twice in the interim. He was running a night inventory check on the medical supplies, morphine specifically, because there was always a morphine discrepancy, and he had a running argument with Sergeant First Class Petra Yang about whether the discrepancy was theft or paperwork error. And tonight he was going to prove it was paperwork. When a shadow separated itself from the equipment shed wall and resolved into Sierra Vaughan in civilian clothing, her crown scar still visible above her left ear. He didn't reach for his weapon. "How did you find this position?" he asked, because it was the most operationally relevant question. "I followed the fuel smell," she said. "Your convoys leave a distinctive signature." That was going to be worth a note to the motor pool sergeant. He filed it and moved on. "You should know," he said, "that your crown is currently underneath 3 days of emergency rations and a spare battery. I didn't think it was safe to keep it somewhere more accessible." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite relief. It wasn't soft enough for that, but the particular quality of tension leaving a face that had been holding it for a very long time. "You kept it." "You asked me to." She looked at him with the same evaluation she'd given him in the tent. And again, he had the sense of a door being measured, not for force, but for what it might open into. He had the feeling she'd spent the past 19 days preparing for the possibility that he'd handed it over to command, and whatever she found when she arrived here would determine the next phase of a contingency plan she'd already thought through. "Most humans would have given it to their command," she said. "Most humans' command would have used it as a bargaining chip," he said. "I didn't think that was what you wanted." "And what do you think I want, Corporal?" "Draven, Cale Draven." He said it before she finished asking, which he suspected was exactly the kind of thing she was testing for. "I think you want to get your crown back to whatever passes for a safe location inside Bloodfang territory without Vorak Grath's people intercepting it. And I think you put it with me because a human logistics convoy is the last place Grath's intelligence assets would think to look." The quiet between them had a different texture now. "You are smarter than your rank suggests," she said. "I'm exactly as smart as my rank suggests," he said. "I'm just in the wrong army for my aptitude." Her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it, the expression of someone who has heard something that would be funny in a different situation, something that might be funny later when things are less immediately dangerous. "I need to get it across the Verk line," she said. "To the Stonemorow Keep, 12 kilometers inside my territory. I have people there who can protect it until," she stopped, "reorganized. Until the political situation stabilizes." "You mean until you can get your council back in line?" "Yes." "How many of Grath's people are between here and Stonemorow Keep?" She told him. The number was not comforting. She told him about the screening positions and the patrol schedules and the 2 checkpoints where Grath had placed his own intelligence assets, and he listened and ran the numbers internally and did not let his expression change while he was doing it, because changing your expression while you're doing math gives people false information about where the math is landing. "Your people can move a package through the Verk line?" she asked. "Supply convoys cross the neutral zone twice a week. Medical resupply. There's a joint processing station at the Kerk crossing point. Both sides use it. Humanitarian protocol. Nobody searches the medical loads." He paused. "They're not supposed to search them." "Grath's units would." "Yes, if they knew to look." He thought about it another beat. "But they'd be looking for you, not for a logistics corporal running a routine medical manifest." The amber eyes held his for a long moment. "You're proposing to run it yourself," she said. "I'm proposing that I understand supply chains and you understand Bloodfang territory, and that between the two of us we probably have enough information to make this work." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not a soldier, Sierra Vaughan. I can't fight my way through 12 kilometers of contested territory. But I've been moving sensitive cargo around war zones for 4 years, and I'm good at it." She studied him the way she had in the tent. Not suspicious, something more specific than that. Measuring for a different quality now. What kind of person makes an offer like this, and what they want in return, and whether what they want is something she can give, and whether what they'll do if she says no is something she can manage. In my culture, she said, a warrior who accepts a charge without knowing the full weight of it is considered a fool, but a warrior who accepts it knowing the weight is considered something else. What's that? Trustworthy, she said. The word is longer in Orcish. What does it mean exactly? She considered. The closest translation is one who counts the cost and carries it anyway. It is a formal designation in the old war tongue. We don't use it often because there are not often people who qualify. He thought about his grandmother counting thunderstorms. Tell me what I need to know, he said. The plan took 4 days to build. It was not elegant. It was functional in the way that good logistics is always functional. Each piece fitted to the next by necessity rather than beauty, with contingencies nested inside contingencies, and a clear understanding that no plan survives contact with reality. But a good plan gives you enough flexibility to recover when reality pushes back. Cale handled the human side. He had an advantage that he'd never considered a strategic asset before. He was invisible. Not literally. He knew he was visible, that he had a face and a body and a uniform that placed him in the 14th Forward Supply Battalion. But he was the kind of invisible that comes from being exactly what you appear to be. Officers looked at him and saw a logistics corporal. Checkpoints looked at him and saw a manifest. Intelligence assets looked at the convoys moving through the Verk neutral zone and saw medical supplies. Nobody looked at a man with a clipboard and a worried expression and thought he was doing anything except worrying about the clipboard. He was good at the worried expression. He'd worn it for 14 months over actual worries, supply shortfalls, manifest discrepancies, the morphine count that never came out right. And the practice meant it sat naturally on his face even when the worry was a different shape. Sierra handled the Bloodfang side. She had contacts he was careful not to ask about. Crown faction sympathizers positioned at Grath's checkpoints, intelligence on patrol rotations, knowledge of a specific 6-hour window when the primary Bloodfang screening unit at the Kerk crossing would be rotating personnel and running below strength. She fed him this information in pieces, through a series of meetings and locations she chose, and he noted with professional appreciation that she varied the meeting pattern. Different times, different positions, no detectable cycle, the way a good operations planner varies route selection. She was, he understood, very good at this, not in spite of being royalty, because of it. She'd been trained her whole life to understand power, who held it, who wanted it, how it moved, how it could be redirected. She understood political intelligence the way he understood supply chains, and the two things turned out to have more in common than he'd expected. Both were fundamentally about flow, where things were, where they needed to be, what was blocking the path between those 2 points, and what it cost to clear the blockage. On the second day of planning, she showed him the route she intended to take separately, on a hand-drawn map that she produced from inside her jacket, small enough to be mistaken for a shopping list, and detailed enough to be immediately recognizable as the work of someone who had been thinking about terrain for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at a poorly loaded manifest, checking not for what was there, but for what might go wrong. This crossing point, he said, touching a spot on the map. Grath's unit has a static observation post here. Changed personnel twice in the last week. I've seen their fuel requisition come through our station under a humanitarian exemption they shouldn't be entitled to, which means someone inside the joint facility is approving exemptions for Iron Tusk logistics. I'd go around this point by at minimum 3 kilometers. She looked at him. You know their fuel requisitions. I know everyone's fuel requisitions, he said. That's what I do. She was quiet for a moment, then adjusted the route. 3 kilometers east, which took it through harder terrain but away from the observation point. Then she looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, not quite approval, but adjacent to it, the expression of someone recalculating an estimate upward. "What else?" she said. "The patrol timing at the ridge access," he pointed. "You've got it marked for 200 to 400 as a low-activity window. That was true 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago they added a supplementary sweep at 300 because someone, probably one of the Crown faction crossing scouts, left a scent trail they picked up. The 300 sweep comes through 20 minutes after the main patrol, not overlapping. Depending on your pace, that's a problem." She looked at him differently now. Not just upward recalibration, something more focused. "How do you know about the Crown faction crossing scouts?" she said. "I don't know anything about them specifically," he said. "I know that Grath's unit added a patrol at an unusual time with unusual spacing, and the only reason you add a patrol with that spacing is if you found evidence of a crossing you didn't expect. The logical source for unexpected crossings at that location is Crown faction scouts. The rest is arithmetic." She folded the map. She refolded it differently, a different crease pattern, which he suspected was a different encoding. Then she looked at him for a moment in the way she had in the tent, that specific focused attention, and he thought she was revising something fundamental about the category she'd put him in. "In Bloodfang," she said, "we have a saying, the warrior who fights well is valuable, the one who thinks well is irreplaceable." She put the map back inside her jacket. "We don't have a saying for someone who does both, because it isn't common enough to warrant one." "I don't fight," he said. "No," she said, "you move things, which is different, and in certain situations significantly more useful." On the third day of planning, they ended up sitting in the lee of a decommissioned equipment trailer, sharing his thermos of terrible camp coffee because it was cold, and she'd been outside for 6 hours, and the coffee was, at minimum, hot. She held the cup in both hands the way anyone holds warmth they've been too long without, and he thought that was a fundamentally human gesture, and then realized he was probably wrong about it being uniquely human. "Tell me about the Crown marking," he said, not because it was operationally relevant. Because he'd been carrying the thing for 3 weeks, and he felt like he owed it some understanding. She was quiet for a moment. The amber eyes went somewhere else and then came back. "There is a star formation the Bloodfang call the warrior's dream," she said. "In the old tongue it means it doesn't translate exactly. Something like the place a spirit goes when it is too stubborn to rest. 7 stars. She touched the back of her left hand, where he'd noticed a constellation of small ritual scars that he'd assumed were decorative. They weren't decorative. They were a sky map, 7 points in the configuration of those 7 stars, placed there by ritual instrument when she was young enough that she hadn't chosen it, but old enough to understand what it meant. My father told me the story when I was 4 years old. The warrior in the story dies in battle and refuses to leave. He stays between the worlds, between fighting and rest, watching over his people. The crown is what binds him. Without it, the warrior has no anchor. Without the anchor, the watching stops." She handed him back the cup. "He put it on my head in front of the full war council," she said. "My father. He had 2 older daughters and 3 sons and 8 war captains with stronger military records and more political allies. Everyone expected him to name Grath's preferred candidate." A pause. "He named me." "Why?" The question hung in the cold air. She considered it the way she considered everything, not avoiding it, just making sure the answer was the right one. "Because I was the only one who understood that the war needed to end," she said. "Not because we were losing. We weren't losing because we were winning the wrong thing." She looked at the dark line of the ridgeline to the north. "You take a plateau and you hold it, you've won ground. But the people on the plateau who hate you for it, they don't go away. You've won ground and made enemies. My father understood that eventually. A beat. He didn't live long enough to do anything about it." Cale thought about 11 years of war. The numbers he knew better than most, not casualties. though he knew those too, but the supply numbers, the logistics numbers, the numbers that told you what a war was actually costing in physical terms, in material attrition, in the specific calculus of what a society can sustain before it stops being able to function. Ammunition expenditure curves, medical resupply rates, the tonnage required to keep a fighting force functional versus the tonnage a plateau could actually produce in food and resources. He'd never thought of those numbers as political information. They were political information. If you get your council back, he said carefully, if the Crown faction wins this political fight, is there actually a path to ending this? She looked at him, not measuring this time. Something more direct. That is why Grath wants me dead, she said. Yes. The convoy moved out at 200 on a Tuesday, which was when the Kerk crossing rotation happened to fall. Cale drove the third vehicle, a standard medical resupply truck, canvas-sided, the kind that had been crossing the neutral zone every Thursday and Tuesday for 8 months, and had never once been opened at a Bloodfang checkpoint without a valid medical protocol override, because both sides' field medics relied on the crossing, and nobody wanted to be the officer who caused 3 battalions of wounded soldiers to run out of blood expanders because he searched the wrong truck. The crown was in his backpack. His backpack was in the cab of the truck, between the seat and the door, wedged in the way it always was, the way any driver wedges their personal kit when they're spending 6 hours behind a wheel in the dark. Invisible because it was exactly where it was supposed to be. The most dangerous object in Bloodfang politics, sitting between a radio battery and 3 days of emergency rations, and the only thing protecting it was the complete predictability of a logistics corporal who always ran the same kit. He'd thought about that for a long time, the invisibility of being ordinary, how the best hiding place for something is among things that look exactly like themselves. Sira was not with him. She had crossed separately, 3 days earlier, through a route she hadn't told him about, which was tactically correct and also meant he'd spent those 3 days not knowing if she was alive. He hadn't examined why that bothered him as much as it did. The examination felt like a distraction from the task at hand, which was getting the crown across the line, and distractions in logistics were the thing that caused discrepancies. The neutral zone at night was a different country. The contested zone was lit by the memory of destruction, burned-out structures on both sides of the demarcation, the chewed ground where neither side had been able to fully process the things that had happened to it, the specific texture of land that has been fought over too many times to go back to being just land. Cale had driven it dozens of times. He knew its landmarks by their damage, the shelled building at the kilometer mark, the cleared mine apron at 3 kilometers, the blast scars at 5 that the convoy always slowed for because the ground was still uncertain. He drove it the same way he always drove it. The checkpoint at the Kerk crossing was a double gate, human side and Bloodfang side, with a joint processing zone between them, where the medical protocols were verified. Cale had his manifest ready, his credentials ready, his expression set to the particular variety of exhausted professionalism that checkpoint officers the world over recognized as belonging to men who had done this too many times to be excited about it and just wanted to get through. The human side waved him through. The Bloodfang side was wrong. He saw it before he reached the gate. The personnel weren't the rotation unit. They were iron tusk markings of Grath's people, not the screening unit that was supposed to be undermanned and distracted. A full complement. 6 soldiers, not 3. An officer he didn't recognize, standing at the gate with his arms loose and his posture completely still. The posture of someone who had been told to expect something and was waiting to see if he was right. Cale kept his speed even, braked at the gate line, rolled his window down. The Bloodfang officer looked at him with amber eyes that were entirely unlike Sira's. Flatter, more certain of themselves, the eyes of a man who hadn't been surprised by anything recently and intended to keep it that way. Medical resupply, Kale said. Standard cross-line protocol, humanitarian category, cargo manifest reference. I know what it is, the officer said. He had standard with a different accent than Sierra's, harder consonants, the speech pattern Kale had come to associate with Grath's Highland Coalition. Step out of the vehicle, please. The please was the most dangerous part. Polite authority, in Kale's experience, was the kind that had already decided what it was going to do. He stepped out. He kept his body language at professionally inconvenienced, not frightened, because frightened was the thing that made people search harder. He moved the way he always moved when a checkpoint was being slower than expected, not fast, not aggressive, but with the specific quality of a man who has a schedule and would like to be back on it. The officer walked to the cab, looked in, looked at the backpack wedged between the seat and the door. Looked at Kale. Whose bag is that? Mine, Kale said. Personal kit. Radio battery, rations, spare socks. I'm out here until 800. The officer looked at him for a long moment. Kale felt the weight of the silence the way he felt the weight of a poorly loaded pallet, not crisis, not yet, but the specific physics of something about to become one. He thought about the crown. He thought about the weight of it in his hands in the tent. He thought about Sierra's voice saying the word for trustworthy in Orcish, the word he didn't know yet but that existed to describe someone who counted the cost and carried it anyway. Open it, the officer said. That's a personal kit search under humanitarian protocol, Kale said. That requires. Open the bag, Corporal. And that was the moment Sergeant First Class Petra Young came out of the passenger-side cab door that Kale had not known she was behind. He'd thought he was running this crossing alone, and she walked around the front of the truck with her tablet and her clipboard, and the expression she wore when she was about to explain something to someone who needed it explained slowly and completely. Evening, Petra said to the officer. Petra Young, 14th Forward Supply, Humanitarian Protocol Officer. I'll need your unit designation and your specific grounds for initiating a personal effects search under Category 2 Protocol, because if you don't have written authorization from a Joint Oversight Officer, you're looking at a formal protocol violation that I am absolutely going to file, because I file everything. She tapped her tablet. Everything. She had the serene, absolute confidence of a woman who had spent 4 years arguing about morphine discrepancies and had never once lost. She looked at the officer the way she looked at manifest errors, with patience and the certainty that the math was going to come out in her favor. The Bloodfang officer looked at her, looked at Kale, looked at the bag, ran some internal calculation. Move along, he said. Kale got back in the truck. He put it in gear. He did not let himself breathe differently until the Bloodfang checkpoint was 100 meters behind him, and the dark road was opening up through his headlights toward the joint processing station. You didn't tell me you were in the truck, he said to Petra. You didn't ask, she said. She was looking at her tablet, entering something. Also, you've been weird for 3 weeks and you smell like orc coffee, and I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone is running something adjacent to the official supply chain. She glanced at him sideways. I didn't need to know what it was. I just needed to know you needed backup. He thought about that for a kilometer. The morphine discrepancy, he said. Was it paperwork or theft? Paperwork, she said. But yours is messier than mine, so technically you owe me. He passed the crown to Sierra's contact at the joint processing station, a medical supply liaison named Tok, who had the specific posture of a person carrying a political secret and was managing it with moderate success. Tok took the pack, removed the crown without ceremony, and returned the pack with everything else still inside. The exchange took 45 seconds and was accomplished, while both of them were ostensibly sorting crate manifests. Kale drove back through the neutral zone as the sky was beginning to gray at the edges. He was tired in a way that went deeper than the hours. the specific exhaustion of tension that has been held too long finally releasing, all at once, with nowhere particular to go. He thought about the weight the crown had had in the pack for 3 weeks, a weight he'd felt even when he wasn't touching it, the way you feel the presence of something that matters. He thought he probably wouldn't see her again. The crown faction would consolidate. The political situation would stabilize or it wouldn't. The war would continue at its grinding pace or it wouldn't. He was a logistics corporal in the 14th Forward Supply Battalion, and she was the heir to the Bloodfang Confederacy, and those two facts existed in entirely different scales of relevance. He went back to counting things. 6 weeks later, Vorak Grath moved. The intelligence summary came down through channels. Iron Tusk coalition forces, an estimated 30,000 combatants, had pushed east out of the Highland territory and were driving towards Stonemarrow Keep. Not a raid, an assault. Grath was done with political maneuvering and had decided the fastest path to the wardenship was through whoever was standing in his way, which was Sira Vorn and the approximately 18,000 Crown faction fighters at and around the keep. The math was grim in the way that math usually was, not uncertain, just ugly. 30,000 besieging an 18,000 garrison in a fortified position on interior lines, with the besieging forces' supply lines extending back through hostile terrain. The defenders had the wall, the attackers had the numbers. The decisive factor was time, whether the defenders could hold long enough for Grath's logistics position to degrade, or whether Grath could break the wall before his supply lines became a problem. Cale ran those numbers 3 times, got the same answer each time. The Crown faction could hold for approximately 6 weeks before they started running genuinely critical shortfalls on medical supplies and food. Grath's supply lines could sustain a siege for approximately 10 weeks before his southern commanders started making their own political calculations about how badly they wanted to be associated with a stalled operation. The gap between 6 weeks and 10 weeks was the problem. He filed a logistics assessment to Major Rist. Rist read it twice, came to find him. "This isn't a resupply calculation," Rist said, his voice flat. "It's also a resupply calculation," Cale said. "The joint processing station does genuinely need more blood expanders." Rist looked at him for a long moment. He was a precise man, Rist, not a cold one, but precise in the way of people who have learned that the gap between what you say and what you mean is where most damage gets done. "You're telling me the Crown faction is running low on everything except resolve. I'm telling you the humanitarian protocol that governs the Kerk crossing applies to all parties operating in the neutral zone, including parties engaged in internal conflict that may affect humanitarian access to joint facilities." He kept his voice level. "I'm also telling you that a resupply convoy crossing to the joint station 3 times a week instead of twice, during the first week of a major military engagement, would represent a statistically normal variance in humanitarian logistics patterns. And inside those convoys would be resupply for the joint station, which is what the manifest would say." Rist looked at his ceiling for a moment. He was thinking through the same math Cale had run. Cale could tell the cost-benefit of what was being proposed, the political exposure, the possible outcomes. "You understand that if you are caught doing what I think you're proposing to do, your rank is the least of your problems." "I understand that the war ending is worth something that my rank doesn't cover," Cale said. "And I understand that I'm better at moving things quietly than I am at most other things." Rist was quiet for a very long time. "The morphine discrepancy," he finally said, "in the medical supply count was paperwork." "Yes," he looked at Cale steadily, "but someone very careful could make certain items appear to route differently than they actually did, if the manifests were handled correctly, theoretically." "Theoretically," Cale said, "that's exactly the kind of thing I'm good at." The next 3 weeks were the most frightening and most clarifying of Cale Draven's life. He ran 6 convoys, Petra ran 2. The cargo was humanitarian goods, medical supplies, food rations, water purification equipment, routed through the joint processing station, and through a series of handoffs that existed only in practice and never on paper, into the logistics chain supporting the Crown faction defenders at Stonemorow Keep. It was not enough to win. It was enough to hold. That was the math he'd calculated, and the math held. He saw Sira once, during the 3rd week, at the processing station at 400 in the gray pre-dawn, while Tak was pulling inventory counts, and the two of them were theoretically reviewing manifest discrepancies. She looked like 3 weeks of siege looked, worn at the edges, the healing scar above her ear now fully knitted into something permanent, her eyes carrying the specific weight of a person who has been making decisions that people die from. "It's working," she said, quiet, not asking. "Grath's supply lines are longer than yours," he said, also quiet. "You're on interior lines. Every day the siege holds, his logistics position degrades relative to yours. 3 more weeks and he starts having to choose between maintaining his encirclement and feeding his southern units." She nodded slowly. "My war captains say the same thing." "Your war captains are right." She looked at him with something that wasn't the evaluating quality she'd first shown him, and wasn't the trusting quality that had come after. Something more direct, more present. "Why are you doing this?" she said, not accusatory, genuine. It was a fair question. He'd thought about it for 3 weeks while running numbers that could get him court-martialed. He had an answer, but it wasn't the kind of answer that fit neatly into words, which made him value it more because, in his experience, the things that don't fit neatly into words are the things you've actually thought all the way through. "Your father understood something," he said, "and he picked someone to understand it after him. And then someone killed him for understanding it." He paused. "I've spent 4 years counting the cost of this war, not the political cost, not the territorial cost, the actual cost. What it takes to keep this many people fighting for this long. I know those numbers better than anyone, and they go in one direction." He met her eyes. "I'm not doing this because I think your side is right. I'm doing this because the cost of a war that ends is always smaller than the cost of a war that doesn't." The amber eyes held his for a long time. Outside the processing station, the sky was starting to shade from black to the particular blue-gray that precedes dawn. Somewhere in the direction of Stonemorow, there was the low sound of artillery, Grath's forces probing the outer walls, testing for soft spots, which they were not going to find because Kale's manifest had been making sure the soft spots stayed patched. "In my culture," she said, "that would make you a war thinker. It is a formal designation, rarer than warriors." "What do war thinkers do?" "They advise the war chief," she said, "on everything that isn't blood." He thought about the morphine count, about manifests that were technically accurate, about the 6-week gap between crisis and resolution, and the 3 weeks of convoy runs that had bridged it. The sound of distant artillery was low and steady, he said, almost to himself. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You should sleep." "You look terrible." Her mouth did the thing again, not quite a smile, but adjacent, the expression that lived just left of humor when everything is too serious for humor, but humor is still reaching for it anyway. "You look exactly like someone who has been falsifying manifests for 3 weeks." "I look exactly like a man reviewing manifest discrepancies," he corrected. "Of course," she said, "my mistake." Grath broke his encirclement on the 22nd day. Not because of the convoys alone. That was too generous a read, and Kale was not generous with his own assessments. The Crown faction's defenders held because they were defending their own stone, which is always an advantage, and because Grath's coalition had the political fragility of any coalition built on ambition rather than loyalty. When the supply situation began to bite and the siege started running long, the Southern commanders started doing their own political calculations, which is what Southern commanders do when they have the time to do them, and the 6-week gap had become a 3-week gap, and then 10 days, and then the math ran out for Grath before it ran out for Sira. He retreated to the Highland territories. He didn't disband. This wasn't over. Nobody with any understanding of Bloodfang politics thought it was over, and Kale had enough understanding of Bloodfang politics by now to know it wasn't. But the immediate crisis was resolved, and Sira Vorn was still alive at Stonemarrow Keep with the crown of the Stone lineage on her head, and that was the condition under which everything else became possible. Kale found out the encirclement had broken the same way he found out about everything in the 14th, through the logistics chain. The medical resupply request from Stonemarrow came in for 3 weeks of post-siege casualty care rather than siege-level emergency provision. That was the number that told you the fighting had stopped. Not any intelligence report, not any official communique. The number of blood expanders a fortification needs tells you more about the state of the battle than any dispatch. Because blood expanders don't lie, and dispatches are written by people with reasons to frame things one way or another. He filed the resupply request. It was technically accurate. He allowed himself one moment of sitting very still with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the work table, feeling the specific quality of relief that comes not from victory but from the confirmation that the math worked. He had calculated that it would. The math always worked, or it didn't, and if it did you could feel it the same way you felt a manifest come out balanced, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet certainty that the numbers were right. Then he opened his eyes and went back to work, because there was always more work, and he was, fundamentally, a man who counted things. The investigation took 4 months. Kale told the truth at all times, which is different from telling the whole truth, and which is a distinction that takes years to understand. The manifests were exactly what they said they were. The routing was within parameters. The humanitarian protocol had been applied consistently and correctly. The fact that consistent, correct application of that protocol happened to coincide with logistically supporting one side of an internal conflict was a contingent fact, not a planned outcome, and the investigation committee spent 4 months failing to prove otherwise because it was not, in fact, otherwise. He was cleared. Petra Young got a commendation she declined to explain to anyone. Rist was promoted, which he received with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was being promoted for and by whom, and thought it was probably worth it. Kale received a formal letter of commendation for, and he read this part twice to make sure he'd understood it, demonstrated initiative and professional commitment in maintaining the integrity of humanitarian cross-line protocols under adverse and operationally challenging conditions. He put it in the same pocket as the note from Sira and the notification of the war's end, and the pocket got heavier but not in a way that was a problem. He'd always been good at carrying weight. Marcus Weil was transferred to the Northern Defense Corridor, which had better coffee and which Kale thought was the correct outcome. Dina Marsh made corporal and was immediately better at the job than Kale had ever been, which was also the correct outcome. The 14th Forward Supply Battalion stood down from expeditionary posture and began the slow bureaucratic process of converting to a joint operations support unit, which meant Kale's manifests now had 2 languages on them, and occasionally said contradictory things in those 2 languages about quantities of specific items, and he found that solving this problem occupied his mind in a way that felt, for the first time in years, like something that pointed forward rather than through. The war didn't end that year. That was too much to hope for. It ended 3 years later, in a negotiated settlement that required all parties to sign off on a framework nobody was entirely happy with, which is what good frameworks look like. Sira Vorn signed as High War Chief of the Bloodfang Confederacy, having consolidated the Crown faction, and spent those 3 years doing what her father had tried to do and been killed for trying. It was slow work, political work, the kind that doesn't look like much from outside and involves a great deal of very careful conversation and several revised manifests of the metaphorical kind. She sent him the formal notification through official channels, which was either protocol or humor, and he thought probably both. At the bottom of the formal document, in a different hand, in standard that was slightly less formal than the rest. The counting was correct. The cost of a war that ends is smaller. SV. He read it twice, folded it, put it in his breast pocket. The first Joint Logistics Coordination meeting was held 6 months after the settlement, at the Kerk crossing point. He attended as the 14th Battalion's logistics representative, now senior sergeant, which was a rank that had happened to him somewhat sideways, and which he wore with the equanimity of a man who has always been surprised by the things that find him rather than the things he goes looking for. He sat across the table from a Bloodfang delegation. He did not know if Sira would be there. He had not asked. She was standing at the back of the room, in the clothing of a civilian administrator, watching the proceedings. Their eyes met across the room. He nodded, she nodded back. The meeting ran 3 hours. When it adjourned, she was gone, and there was a folded note on the table where she'd been standing. He opened it. The warrior's dream constellation is visible from the ridge above Kerk on clear nights. I thought a war thinker might want to see it properly, with the right guide. He looked at the note for a long time. Outside, through the narrow window of the converted checkpoint facility, he could see the ridge above Kerk, going dark as the evening came on, the first stars beginning to show against the deep blue of the sky. He finished the supply count. He always finished the supply count. Then he went to the ridge. She was there, standing at the high point with the dark line of the Bloodfang highlands at her back and the human-held lowlands spread out below, and the sky above them both was enormous and clear, the kind of clear that only happens when weather has been blown through and left everything washed. The 7 stars of the warrior's dream were rising in the east, exactly where she'd said they would be. He stood beside her and looked at them. 7 stars, he said, the warrior who was too stubborn to rest. Yes, she said, he watches over his people from the space between fighting and rest. She was quiet for a moment. My father believed that the best leaders live there, in that space, not at rest and not at war. Watching, thinking. Your father was right, Kale said, about most things. Most things, she agreed. The wind came off the highland, with the smell of fir trees and cold stone. What does a war thinker do when the war is over? He asked. She looked at him sideways. The amber eyes caught the starlight and held it, steady and warm. A war thinker advises the war chief on everything that isn't blood, trade routes, supply chains, a pause, logistics. I'm familiar with logistics, he said. I know, she said. That's why I hid the crown in your bag. He thought about that. About the specific weight of a bronze circlet pressed into a stranger's hands in the dark of a supply tent, and everything that had followed from that single act of calculated trust. The count, the cost, the convoys, the calculations, the 3 weeks that bought 3 years that bought a settlement that nobody was entirely happy with, and that was therefore exactly right. You'd already decided, he said. Before you put it in my bag, you'd already decided you wanted a human war thinker. I decided, she said carefully, that I had looked at many warriors and found them useful, and then I fell through a wall in a supply depot and found something more useful. She looked back at the stars. A person who knew the cost of things. Exactly. The warrior's dream was fully risen now, all 7 stars sharp and resolved against the black. He understood, looking at them, why the Bloodfang had named them for a warrior who refused to stop watching. The stars didn't move the way you expected stars to move. You couldn't see the motion directly, only the result, the slow accumulated rotation of the sky, the same way you couldn't see a war ending but could see the evidence afterward in the empty supply lines and the repurposed checkpoints, and the meetings that ran 3 hours because both sides had enough trust to argue about morphine inventory. I should tell you, he said, that I'm not actually a warrior, not even a little bit. I know, she said. Warriors are useful for about 5 years before the injuries accumulate. War thinkers are useful for considerably longer. He exhaled, not quite a laugh but something in that direction. I have conditions, he said. Of course you do. Petra Young gets a seat at any joint logistics coordination table. She's better than me at arguing, and I need someone to argue with. Done. The Care Crossing stays a joint facility, permanently. It was already in the settlement. I know I wrote that clause, he looked at her. I want it enforced. It will be enforced, she said. I enforce things. He believed her. He had for some time believed her about most things. And the morphine variants, he said, officially on the record paperwork. She turned to look at him fully. The amber eyes were doing something he hadn't catalogued yet, not measuring, not evaluating, something quieter than both. Paperwork, she said, obviously. Above them, the 7 stars of the warrior's dream burned in the cold, clean air. Not moving, not resting, watching from the space between fighting and rest over the people below who were, with considerable difficulty and many revised manifests, trying to figure out how to stop hurting each other. He thought about his grandmother counting thunderstorms. 1, 2, 3, not to measure the distance of the lightning, but to have something steady to hold while the world was loud. He had, it turned out, been wrong about one thing, not about the math was correct, but about whether he was brave. Brave was the wrong category. The category he fit was something the Bloodfang had a longer word for, which he was going to have to learn eventually, the word that meant counting the cost and carrying it anyway. He started learning it that night, standing on the ridge above Kerk with the stars coming out overhead, and the war folded up and put away behind them, and the highland wind cold and clean against his face, and beside him someone who had pressed a crown into a stranger's hands and trusted the math to work out. The count came out the same every time. He was glad he'd carried the weight.